Many people have commented on where we are a decade after the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement was, you know, uh, accepted or agreed upon in 2015. We are now in 2026, so last year. Several articles came out. This one by Somani Gupta in the New York Times came out in November 2025. I like her writings, and she does a good job here with 10 points, and each section has nice references to other articles. So here is a nice PT diagram showing where Paris, this is the historical emissions of CO2. You can also add other greenhouse gases, but when we signed the Paris Agreement, we were here, then COVID came, but we have rebounded, and these are sort of the projections out to 2100, and there is a lot of debate about where the uncertainties in the projections come from. So this is 10 years after a breakthrough climate pact. Here's where we are. Okay, almost exactly 10 years ago, a remarkable thing happened in a conference hall on the outskirts of Paris. An agreement was signed, and the core idea was that countries would set their own targets to reduce their climate pollution in ways that made sense for them. The Kyoto Protocol was kind of a top down approach with Annex 1, Annex 2, and all these things, and essentially did not perform very well. So this is more democratic, where countries are submitting their own plans, and by now in 2026, many countries, almost all countries, have updated their plans to stay on target for net zero, and the warming targets set up in Paris Agreement. There was some history, 2 degrees C, and then it became 1.5 degrees C because of the demand from Alliance of Small Island and Developing States. So anything changed? Let me read again. So, has anything changed over the 10 years? Actually, yes, quite a bit, for the better and for the worse. That's why I titled this podcast as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I love that movie as well, old one. So, every country remains committed to the Paris Agreement except one. That's the United States. We wanted to help you cut through the noise and show you 10 big things that have happened in the last 10 years. That's Somini and her graphics person. Emissions are still rising, but not as fast as they were. We have already discussed these. So the idea is to again look at historical emissions. These are global greenhouse gas emissions and not just CO2. And the expected warming, we are at about 80 gigatons CO2 equivalent per year at the top of the scale here. So we are somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 when you include non-carbon CO2, non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So historical emissions and COVID and the spikes, there was a dip, and then we recovered right back with all kinds of stimulus plans for bumping up economies that had slowed down. And current pathway is down here at 2.5 to 2.9 degrees C. Pre-Paris pathway was 3.3 to 3.8 degrees C. So this is a good way to see that Paris Agreement may have set us off in a much better pathway, and we still scream about exceeding the threshold of 1.5 degrees C and crossing 2 degrees C by 2100 and so on. But as I've always argued, we need to worry about keeping it as low as possible and not set up targets and then scream about them being exceeded and so on, considering neither 2 degrees C nor 1.5 degrees C are really rigorously scientifically derived targets. They were just, made up in some ways. Okay, so none of the world's biggest emitters, China, the US, and European Union, India, have met their Paris promises, and every degree of warming matters. A 1 degree increase in average temperature, for instance, raises malaria risk for children in sub-Saharan Africa by 77%. This is assuming business as usual, but business as usual is basically not a good way to think about these things anymore. But nonetheless, we need to be aware of the specific risks and at hyper-local scales if possible. Second one, the last 10 years were the hottest on record. So intraannual variability shows up in global mean temperatures, but when you average decades, which is the climate, intraannual variability is related to, melting glaciers or heat into the oceans, El Ninos, La Ninas, and so on. But decade to decade, we are getting warmer and warmer decades. So 2024 average was plus 1.6 degrees C. 2025 was calmer than that, but this is what we expect. 2023 was very warm with an El Nino. 24 became the record warm year, and these things tend to go back to the background rate of warming, even though we haven't fully understood why 2023, 24 were so warm. I have podcasts on that elsewhere. So the most scorching year was 2024. Uh, to read another blurb, solar panels hang from apartment balconies in Germany and cover vast areas of desert in Saudi Arabia. Solar and onshore wind projects offer the cheapest source of new electricity generation. Little wonder then that India's electricity sector, more than half of the generation capacity now comes from solar, wind, and hydropower. So in India, that's what is happening, and India says it's ahead of the targets for 2030, which is good news, but we still burn coal, so that has to go away. So the third one then is that solar is spreading faster than we thought it would. So you can see the numbers here. Forecasts keep underestimating solar growth. It's not a completely done deal in terms of recycling and other things, and lots of research goes on in improving the efficiencies, and there are flexible solar cells, organic solar cells, 3D printing, and so on. So 2015 to 2030, 600 gigawatts of added capacity at the top here, and we have gone from basically around zero to by 2025 well over 600 for the globe, and the projections remain. You can see where the projections were for each year, and we have exceeded every time, and the current projections say this, but you can expect that more and more countries are catching on, especially China selling lots of cheap solar cells to everybody. So even African countries and so on are going gangbusters on solar deployment. You have to always see if new demand is being met by fossil fuel power generation or renewables. And the good news is that lots of the new energy demand, growing energy demand, is often met mostly with renewables, which is good news. That's why a rate of increase of the emissions is slowing down, even though emissions themselves are still going up. Electric vehicles are now normal, but there are many details there. The numbers of the actual market share is not that big. Plus, China has very good electric vehicles, but other markets will not allow them to protect their own market. So it's not a global mitigation plan in that sense. You still have to worry about economies while you worry about global climate mitigation and so on. Number of new cars sold, you are up to 80 million here, going from 2015 to 2024. So total cars and then electric in China, the number is huge. Fossil fuel cars go down, electric cars keep adding, but US is not doing so well, as you can see. Electrifying transportation is important because it's one of the biggest sources of emissions globally. Currently, electric vehicles are displacing 2 million barrels of oil demand per day, roughly equal to Germany's total daily demand, according to Bloomberg and EF. But again, there are many details. You can argue that we are not moving fast enough, or that the investments in fossil fuel based internal combustion engines are not stopping quite yet. Numbers have to grow much faster, and charging network infrastructure and energy to charge the batteries have to come from renewables. So all sorts of details are hidden in there, but overall good news. The fifth one, rich countries have put relatively little money on the table, so climate finance, loss and damage, etc., keeps struggling, but everybody is at the table lobbying or agreeing, or even the European Union countries which seem progressive commit, and then there is some back and forth dancing that goes on. Public climate finance from developed countries would need to increase substantially. From 2016, it has to reach 300 billion as agreed upon by 2035. That's the pledged. Has to go up. In 2022, funding broke the 100 billion mark US dollars for the first time. Meanwhile, some of the poorest countries are getting clobbered by extreme weather. They are falling deeper into debt as they try to recover. So basically, as climate impacts keep hammering these poorest countries, they cannot keep struggling just managing the crises as they come along, but they have to have room in the budget and fiscal policies, etc. Have to consider saving money for building resilience, which is a longer term investments, but that's hard right now. And there are other details here for the $100 billion climate finance. Where is it exactly going? These issues of conflating development projects with climate adaptation projects, lots of details we have to worry about. But nonetheless, let's say it's not or less bad news rather than great good news. Coal is in a weird place. The growth of coal is slowing worldwide. That matters because coal, which powered the modern industrial economy, is the dirtiest fossil fuel. But energy market perturbations from various conflicts can bring back coal at least temporarily. And some countries like India and China will burn coal for a while, even though less and less. And countries like US still mine coal, and the current president has even promised to ramp up the mining, and they export coal. So who's responsible for the emissions, right? So uh, Britain, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, closed its last coal plant in 2024. That year, more than half of Britain's electricity came from renewables, but coal is still growing in China, which, despite its pledge to clean up the economy, has gone on to building more coal plants than any other country ever. So it's not just that they are not phasing out coal, they are building new coal power plants. Okay. In America, coal demand fell faster than expected. If it becomes economically unfeasible, then maybe you will leave it in the ground. But if you can still dig it up and export just for political spite, you may keep digging it up, right? So here are the numbers 2000 to 2035, which project with projections. You are looking at megatons here, 1,000 megatons. So the actual coal demand fell, but projections went this way at various years, and now they are saying it will continue to drop. So in China, on the other hand, it grew faster than expected. Projections were all over the place, but you can see that the actual numbers have exceeded all projections in the past, and now projections are still showing slower growth rates. China is going really, really big on renewables, and hopefully that means they will phase out coal, but they also have big ambitions on growing the economies, and the energy needed will burn whatever it gets. So coal is one of the ones that still remains very active. Natural gas, a planet-warming fossil fuel, is ascendant thanks to America. Even Europe started calling natural gas as a low-emission fossil fuel after Russian tap closed. They were going for gas from Norway and US, and they are obviously happy to sell gas and call themselves low emissions and so on. So you can see here 2014 to 2024, US has gone completely on top of everybody else. Australia has remained at the similar level. Sorry, that's Qatar. Australia has ramped up and then has remained steady for the last few years. Russia has done the same. You have to worry about who's exporting, who's importing, and where emissions are counted, etc. as well. Mr. Trump, in his second term, has supersized the ambition to produce more gas. He appointed Chris Wright, a former fracking executive, as the U.S. Energy Secretary, and he has used the sale of American gas as a diplomatic and trade cudgel. That matters because while gas is cleaner than coal as a source of electricity, it stands to lock the world into gas use for decades to come, which means weaning out of fossil fuels is not going to happen for much longer. Eighth one, forests are losing their climate superpower. Lots of reports saying that forests are now becoming net emitters rather than absorbers. Wildfires are going crazy as well. So world's forests are absorbing less carbon dioxide, and you can see gigatons of CO2. There is a baseline being used here. So you can see 2001 minus 10 gigaton CO2, so absorbing a reasonable amount. And then the numbers have had some interannual variability, but now in 2024, forests absorbed only 2.2 gigatons more CO2 than they emitted. very small numbers. So there's always large influx for photosynthesis, and then uh, respiration, deforestation, land use change, etc. So in the net, they only absorbed 2.2 gigatons more CO2 than they emitted. So that's limiting the ability of many forests in terms of deforestation, fires, logging, lack of protection, etc. Uh, in fact, it's pushing parts of Amazon rainforest, often called the lungs of the planet, to a startling tipping point. I'm always nervous about this phraseology, but nonetheless, parts of the Amazon are releasing more carbon than trees and soil are absorbing. One recent study found the same pattern in rainforests of Australia as well. So the question of how to incentivize these forest protections, is Amazon really the lung of the world? If so, who will pay for it to be protected, and how will you prevent President of Brazil from deforesting for soybean, for development, for whatever else, right? Nine corals are bleaching more often since 2015. Two separate global bleaching events have stretched over 6 years. They are happening much more often than before and affecting more reefs because the oceans are heating up fast. I have discussed what is coral bleaching elsewhere, in case you don't know. Percent of the world's coral reefs affected by each bleaching event. In 98, it was about 21%, and 97, 98 was the strongest El Nino of the 20th century. By 2010, it was 37%. 2014 to 17, it was up to 68%. 2023-25 has been the record warm period, with debates about crossing 1.5 and so on. So now we have 84% bleaching events across the planet. So corals are important because they support so many other creatures, including fish, that millions of people rely on for nutrition and income. About a quarter of all marine species depend on reefs at some point in their life cycle. Many reefs have been ravaged, but some coral species are turning out to be more resilient to marine heat waves than we had thought. That's goodish news too. So you have to understand why some seem to do fine or even thrive. I have a couple of podcasts on that. There are some corals, for example, they have symbiont algae that live on them, and some of them are low temperature tolerant, some are high temperature tolerant. Some corals are smart enough to get rid of the low temperature tolerance algae and take on high temperature tolerant algae to survive the warming. Is there a genetic trait that allows them to do it? If so, can we graft them onto uh, reefs that are not doing so well to protect all of them? All kinds of nice experiments are going on in the lab and in the field, and there is geoengineering approaches being tried in terms of brightening the cloud over the reefs to protect them and so on. So we keep trying, but we are always two steps ahead in terms of the destruction. 10, U.S. electricity demand is soaring in part because of AI. Just using AI for everything from your phone to your homes to cars, uh, everything, and of course data centers. Everybody wants to save all the data, all messages, all photos, videos, emails, everything. So we have lots of data centers hogging a lot of power and water. Power demand had always been expected to increase worldwide. More than 1 billion people still need access to electricity, but essentially AI came along. It's seen as a boost to so many things, including weather and climate forecasts and genetics and discovery of materials and so on. But this is a sudden spike in energy demand as well. So American electricity demand was pretty flat in the 2010s, but is now rising significantly and is projected to climb for at least another decade. One reason, energy hungry AI. That raises a critical question for the big tech. Will its AI ambitions heat up the planet faster? Fortunately, many of the big four, let's say Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Google are actually even Meta should be there. Big five, let's say, they are all trying to develop their own energy sources. Even nuclear is being considered, geothermal, wind, solar, and so on, to meet their own energy demands, because many of the places can't meet their energy demands. So after 2 decades of solar demand growth, energy needs are rising much faster. So we are looking at here millions of gigawatt hours, and actual energy demand has gone somewhat up and down here. COVID can be seen, but projections were all here. and obviously we have stayed under, but now 2024 projection is way over here, more than 5 million gigawatt hours by 2030. So we have to see whether we'll keep beating our own expectations in terms of renewables to meet the growing energy demand, or if we will ramp up fossil fuels willy-nilly. Okay. To conclude, what does all this mean for the world's 8 billion people? The physical damage inflicted by global warming costs the global economy around $1.4 trillion a year, according to Bloomberg and EF. Uh, it means we are being forced to adapt to new conditions. We it means we are being forced to adapt to new conditions on a climate altered planet. Many already are, especially the most vulnerable among us. In India, a women's union has created a tiny new insurance plan to help workers cope when it gets dangerously hot. In China, a landscape architect has persuaded cities to create porous surfaces to let floodwaters seep in. In the United States, school playgrounds are adding shade to protect kids on exceptionally hot days. In California, an app developer created a tool to help his neighborhood track the path of wildfires. In Malawi and Uganda, people are experimenting with growing different crops. A big problem is there is very little money to help them, and even that has declined in the last couple of years. So, climate finance, adaptation finance, etc., are not ramping up as fast as the demand for them is growing up. So, loss and damage and assigning responsibilities and who will pay for this, who's responsible, who's suffering, who will pay for the damage beyond the capacity to adapt, and so on, are all complicated issues being discussed on various forums under the UN, including COPs. Okay, so it's a nice article. I wanted to record it, and I like so many writings, and this is a good summary. Okay, read the article if you're interested. She has provided some very nice references which are worth following up with if you are interested in this. Okay.